The squad is getting a tour of the impressively large shuttle they've just boarded from none other than their former squad mate Nubby. Last they'd seen him, he'd been reassigned to quartermaster duties after his legs were removed by a treacherous interrogator. Now he's happily stomping around on a pair of augmetic legs while proudly explaining how he's the mission's supply officer. This announcement is being met with considerable skepticism by Sarge, who is the only member of the squad actually listening. Doc is paying far more attention to Nubby's shiny new metal legs and is interrupting the rambling tour with questions about how they'd been attached. When Nubby doesn't provide any helpful answers, Doc asks Sarge to hold the little trooper up so he can take a look. Meanwhile, Twitch's curiosity and paranoia are driving him to find out just what is inside the large metal container being loaded onto the shuttle. Cutter, who found the lack of sword-related topics in the tour incredibly boring, is helping the demolitions trooper by prying open one of the boxes. When the lid finally pops off, both guardsmen jump back and start swearing. Doc and Sarge, who is still holding Nubby up by the shoulders, come over to see what the matter is. When Sarge sees what's inside the container, as well as the identical markings on all the other containers, he starts shaking the suspended guardsman like an angry terrier. "Nubby, just why the hell are we taking a few thousand servitors with us?" The all-guardsman party buys a spaceship. So no shit, there we were. On a shuttle filled with tech priests and an army of servitors. On our way to assist in the purchase of an entire warp-capable starship for our Inquisitor. Not a normal space transport, not a shuttle, not a flyer, but an entire damned warpship. The smallest of which were typically over a kilometer long and worth more than a dozen regiments of guard. And to top it all off, Nubby Nubs was standing there, proud as anything, telling the rest of us that he was in charge of the operation. It was completely unbelievable. To clarify, it wasn't unbelievable in the sense that we couldn't fathom how the universe could be so strange and cruel. We literally didn't believe a word Nubby said. No one with a scrap of intelligence would send him out to buy the recaf, much less a bloody warpship. Sure, we'd all trust Nubby at our back in a firefight any day, but the man was a petty thief, a compulsive liar, and had actually been mistaken for a Gretchen on more than one occasion. Sarge told the trooper to stuff a sock in it, and we all went to get a more realistic briefing from the tech priests that were coming with us. There seemed to be a lot of cogboys on the big cargo shuttle with us. Every room or hallway was filled with creepy metal men squawking at each other in binary. We found the one that Oak had implied was the head tech priest in a conference room surrounded by a bunch of subordinates. He was obviously holding some sort of conference or briefing, but we couldn't understand any of their robotic chatter. Sarge just stood there awkwardly, and then started loudly clearing his throat until a few cogboys were waved away to deal with us. That became an annoying trend over our journey. The head tech priest and his senior flunkies would never talk to us directly. We were sure they could understand Gothic, but they just never seemed to speak in anything but their damned machine language. Every time we needed to talk to one of them, a junior cogboy would be called up to act as a translator or lead us away so we didn't disturb the senior techies. This did not endear them to us, and we didn't go out of our way to treat them any better. We did get pretty familiar with the junior tech priests, though. Well, not exactly familiar. There were a bunch of them, and it was damned hard to pick out which pile of metal tentacles was Brother Ticinius and which was Brother Cassistus. Woe betide the poor guardsman who mistook Logis Guminio for Constructor Periphanes. Such a mistake was incredibly insulting, and a clear indication of our inferior intellect. Matters were not helped by their damned tendency to switch out their augmetics. Just when you get used to Arc Brother Lexi Mechanic Cogitus Boyus being the tall bastard with the heavy-duty servo arm, he'd swap it out for some sort of sparky tentacle job and replace his legs with treads or something. We would have gone crazy if it weren't for the two lowest-ranking tech priests in the bunch, tech acolytes Jim and Hannah. The two acolytes were the most junior tech priests on the mission, and were obviously the Mechanicus equivalent of the regimental gopher. Every time you saw them, they'd be carrying something, moving as fast as possible without running, or covered head to toe with grease and other less pleasant fluids. We liked Jim and Hannah. They were practically kids, had most of their original parts, and you could pronounce their names while drunk. Best of all, they had a weary, put-upon attitude which warmed the khaki-colored blobs which passed for our souls. We quickly made them honorary guardsmen and began taking all of our questions to them. Once we met Jim and Hannah, we were finally able to get the real details of our mission. The gist of it was that the tech priests and our squad were all being sent to discreetly purchase a second-hand warpship, presumably so it could be used to carry around Oak's recruitment teams without causing a fuss. To our collective relief, the acolytes confirmed that Nubby was not in charge of the operation. He was merely there to act as the public face for the purchase and general observer. His superiors in supply had already chosen the ship, negotiated a price range, gotten the funds into place, hired a navigator and astropath, and handed Nubby a very explicit set of orders. The head Magos and the other tech priests would handle everything else, and be more or less in command from the second the ship was deeded over and the original crew was evicted. They'd do the inspection, prep the ship for travel, and perform any repairs. Finally, once the priests deemed the ship ready for travel, they'd use their servitor army to fly the whole damned thing back to some secret Inquisition shipyard for a refit. This all made sense to us, but it was still a wonder that Nubby had been chosen for any part of this mission. He insisted that his superiors had recognized his quisition skills and personal experience with ships like this, not to mention his clever negotiation tactics and cunning mercantile mind. This was bullshit, and we all knew it. To a man, the rest of us believed that he'd been sent because no one would ever look at him and think inquisitorial agent. The rest of us were there to act as backup for Nubby. Officially, this was because every procurer in the field was supposed to have a bunch of trustworthy and discreet agents to assist them. At first, we wondered just why we had been chosen over other available agents, but after we figured out why Nubby had been sent, it was plain as day why we were sent. Obviously, our squad had been chosen because we all looked like the sort of incompetent ex-guard goons that a complete cretin would employ as bodyguards. Thanks, Oak. Now, we'd traveled a fair bit during our careers in the Inquisition, but this trip was something else. This time, we didn't have our own quiet section of the ship. Instead, we were surrounded by dozens of cogboys running around preparing an army of servitors for crewing a warpship. Everywhere you went, there'd be tech priests chattering at each other, chanting and lighting incense, welding random pieces of metal, or doing incredibly unsettling things to their servitors. The ship itself was some sort of Mechanicus transport, and the quarters available made us all think wistfully of the berths the Rupert had gotten for us. Apparently, when you become a full tech priest, you stop desiring beds fancier than a wide metal shelf, or food that actually has flavor. Also, Mechanicus toilets can best be described as terrifying. We all tried to stay out of the way and keep to ourselves, but it just didn't work. We always seemed to be underfoot or under tread or under anti-grav skimmer. There simply wasn't room for anyone that wasn't part of whatever mad plan the techies were all following. Cargo haulers would bolt through us during morning PT. Random tech priests would shout at us if we touched or sat on anything, and our quarters were randomly repurposed for storage, sometimes while we were still in them. No man should wake up in a dark room surrounded by 30 deactivated servitors. None of us were happy, but Twitch had the worst of it. He just couldn't function well without a secured perimeter. We were about ready to outright fortify a cargo bay and try to hold it off against the cogboys, when Doc got his idea. He suggested that the only way to survive the trip was to become part of the pattern. We spent the rest of the voyage following Jim and Hannah around like lost puppies. We slept where and when they slept. We ate when they ate, and did our best to help with whatever unpleasant task they were working on. We probably weren't very helpful, but it kept us alive and relatively sane. It was an immense relief when we finally reached our destination. We piled onto a shuttle and rode to a local orbital station where a few scribes were waiting to brief us on the purchase. We blew them all off and slept for about 20 hours in the blissful quiet of our cogboy-free rental rooms. The briefings and preliminary negotiations took about a week, and aside from Nubby, none of us really had to do anything. We more or less hung out in hallways while various scribes became incredibly frustrated with Nubby. There were no assassination attempts, no cultist infiltrators, no orc commando raids, and certainly no gene stealer attacks. Just a bunch of boring guard duty while Nubby drove various expensive lawyers and financial experts into a state of incoherent rage. One of them did actually try to kill him, but since Nubby had just stolen the man's wallet, it was perfectly understandable. We did pay a little attention to what was going on. Guard duty was boring, and they weren't really hiding the documents or diagrams. Most of it was legal gibberish, ancient trade logs, and figures about engine strength and storage capacity, none of which we even tried to understand. But there were some nice pictures. From what we saw, the ship was a small one, only 2 kilometers long, and was rather plain looking. Just the sort of ship for traveling around unnoticed. The negotiations continued, and some of the tech priests were being sent over to inspect the ship. They took a while, but confirmed that the ship met all requirements. That done with, all that was left was the final meeting between Nubby and the current owner of the vessel. Some fancy rooms were rented out for the deal, and Nubby was crammed into a frilly suit, complete with powdered wig. It was probably supposed to make him look like a dashing imperial nobleman, but it really just made him look like a Gretchen in a dress. It was hard not to laugh as we followed him to the meeting, and when we saw the man selling the ship, it became nearly impossible. If Nubby was a Gretchen in a dress, then the seller was a giant squig in a suit. The man was practically spherical, comically clumsy, and honked like a goose when he talked. He radiated an aura of incompetence, and was followed by a cadre of thugs who all had the same suffused expressions we did. The worst part was that the man obviously thought of himself as a rogue traitor and tried to dress the part. He must have gone through some catalog and ordered one of everything. He had the gaudy coat with epaulettes, the large hat with a feather in it, the cane that obviously contained a sword, and just to top it off, there was a cybernetic parrot perched on his shoulder. The problem was that while most rogue traders ooze confidence in danger, this one just oozed. We'd seen, fought, and redecorated a bathroom with the head of a real rogue trader before. This guy was more like a kid playing dress-up. We just barely managed to keep our faces straight while Nubby and the wannabe greeted each other. Both of them were handed the relevant documents by their scribes and headed into a private room to complete the deal. The second the door closed behind them, the fat man's guards cracked up, and we did likewise. It was just too much to bear. Both sets of scribes just shared a miserable look and settled down to wait. The meeting took a surprisingly long time, and we all started to get nervous. Every part of the deal had been hammered out beforehand, and this was just supposed to be a matter of signing off. Emperor only knew what Nubby was getting up to in there. Neither of them hit their panics buttons, though, so we sat tight, and eventually both men came out alive and relatively well. Nubby had a disturbingly smug look, and the seller seemed rather flustered, but both of them insisted that everything was sorted out. The scribes did a final review of the signed documents, got into a brief whispered argument with Nubby and the fat man, and then loudly confirmed that everything was in order. The seller's scribes said that all of their men would be off the ship within 30 hours, and the whole party made a rather hasty exit. That done with, we headed back to our quarters and passed the word on to the tech priests. The cog boys confirmed that they were ready to board the ship and take over as soon as the former crew was out of the way. From there on out, it was entirely their mission. We were just passengers and observers. All our squad had to do was keep out of the way until we arrived at the shipyard and someone came to collect us. The tech priest told us to stay in our quarters until they had their servitors in place, so we finished our business with the scribes, settled in for a few days of relaxation on the station, and asked Nubby what had happened during the meeting. According to him, the former captain had been a terrible negotiator and was easily haggled down. The little bugger was smug as hell about the whole thing and expected a big thank you from Oak for saving him a few billion thrones. None of us really believed him. Nubby was always full of that sort of shit, but the scribes were happy, so it wasn't really our problem. In retrospect, not grilling Nubby and finding out exactly what sort of deal he got, or how he managed to get it, was a tremendous mistake. A few days of idleness later, a shuttle was sent for us, and we were taken to the new edition of Oak's fleet, the free trader Occurrence Border. As we approached the ship, everyone clustered around the windows to get a good look at our purchase. A lot of things about the Occurrence Border grabbed the eye. There were massive tanks for hauling fluids, the impressive arrays of docking hatches along the cargo bays, the odd variations in color and design of the hull, but mostly there was the fact that the ship was about half as long as the diagrams said it should be. It was amazing, really. The Occurrence Border mostly followed the standard Imperial ship layout. Large engines in the tail, control tower rising above the rear of the ship, long and slightly skinny body, except the bow was completely gone. The ship just ended halfway through the body in a giant patchwork of scrap metal. It looked like someone had grabbed the ship, cut it with a giant cleaver, and then smashed the ragged edge flat. As one, we all turned to look at Nubby, who muttered something about good value for cost and tried to sidle away. It took a lot of shaking and yelling to get all the details out of Nubby. Apparently, the front fell off. The entire front of the vessel, a 2-kilometer warp-capable ship, which had just been purchased for a staggering amount of money on behalf of the bloody Inquisition, fell off. He said it doesn't happen often, just a sort of occasional time-to-time thing. Overall, it is a very safe ship. In fact, in the whole lifetime of the ship, it only happened once, or twice. Well, maybe 3 times. Definitely no more than 4. But the important thing was that it would never, ever happen again. The previous captain had fixed the problem for good by installing the special-made custom prow after the last incident. We all eyed the mushroom-shaped pile of slagged scrap on the front end of the ship and contemplated just what Oak would do to us. It would probably involve an excruciator and an airlock. The rest of the flight was split between yelling at Nubby and staring at the ship with a sort of morbid curiosity. The closer we got, the more the imperfections became apparent. There were scars and burns, holes and gouges, and the most bizarre set of repairs and additions imaginable. The entire ship must have been stripped off and replaced with spare parts one piece at a time until nothing of the original was left visible. It was a wonder that the thing flew at all. Doc suggested that we might not get yelled at by Oak for any of this, because there was no way we'd survive the warp voyage home in this hulk. Eventually, the shuttle docked, and we walked into one of the Occurrence Border's more intact cargo bays. Hannah the Cog Girl was waiting to guide us to our quarters. She led us through a maze of tunnels and gave us a rundown of situation on the way. Most of the servitors were in place, the navigator and astropath were on board, and the last few repairs and calibrations would be made during the trip. After a while, Sarge cautiously asked her what the tech priests thought about the state of the ship. Her response surprised us. She cheerily informed us that the entire vessel was an abomination in the eyes of the Omessiah and perfectly met all requirements. That second part was a little confusing, but according to her, the whole point was to acquire a thoroughly disreputable vessel that was still capable of running. The Cogboys didn't care if half the ship was missing, if the cargo bays leaked atmosphere, or if most of the ship was pieced together from old wrecks. As long as it could travel through the warp, they were happy. After all, they were just here to take it to the shipyard. The priests were the ones who would be refitting it for inquisitorial use. Nubby perked up at this, but Sarge reminded him that even if the tech priests were happy, the people who were paying for the ship and its refit probably wouldn't be. As we walked, all of us noticed dozens of papers fixed to panels, doors, controls, and such. At first, we thought they were the usual purity seals or Mechanicus prayers, but then Twitch stopped and actually read a few. Each one said something like, "This control panel governs the flow of plasma through bays D3, S15. No one remembers why we have plasma going through there, but if you shut them off, engines 3 and 7 stop working. The gravity in this corridor is tilted 37 degrees to the left, and do not ever touch this button." The last one showed up a lot. When we asked Hannah about the notes, she lowered her voice and advised us to take them very seriously. They must have been left by the former crew and were incredibly helpful, but we were never to mention any of them to the more senior tech priests. The cogboys were trying to ignore them since they didn't need advice from anyone outside the priesthood, but unfortunately, the notes were far more accurate than their own scans. The senior priests were taking it as a personal insult every time they had to refer to one of the notes to fix a problem. We all chuckled at that and promised to read any notes we came across. Eventually, we arrived in a cluster of rooms that Jim the Acolyte was clearing out with the help of a bunch of servitors. He suggested that these would make good quarters, pointed us towards a storage chest with some relatively edible rations in it, handed us a data slate with a crude map of the ship, and recommended that we stay out of the way of the servitors and tech priests. Once we were settled, the two acolytes scampered off to their next task. Sarge booted up the data slate, and about 10 seconds after Jim and Hannah had disappeared into the giant maze of metal that was our ship, we realized that none of us knew how to read a three-dimensional map. The ensuing argument over whose job it had been to check the map earlier, and what we were going to do now, was interrupted by the ship's speakers blaring to life. There was a painful burst of binary, followed by a monotone voice telling all hands to prepare for warp transport. Then the universe went glorp and tasted like the color purple for a second. The one good thing you could say about the situation was that no one was trying to kill us. At least, not on purpose, anyway. On the other hand, we were cruising through the warp in a twisted heap of scrap held together with tape and spit, and none of us even knew where in the ship we were, or how to read our map. Now, being lost is a long-standing guard tradition, but this was ridiculous. It's hard enough to navigate in 2 dimensions with an accurate map and a directional finder. 3 with an unreadable map and no way to tell which way you're facing is just unfair. Without the ration bars, we might have actually starved to death in our own ship, or at least been reduced to hunting the servitors for food. After our quarters were secured, we started trying to track down one of the tech priests. We wanted to know where everyone else was, what was going on, and how the hell to read our map. Our comms didn't work for shit inside all this metal, and we didn't have access to the ship's communication systems. So our search had to be done the old-fashioned way, on foot with hand-drawn maps and trail markers. We didn't feel like passengers on a ship. It was more like we were a recon force plotting hostile terrain, and boy was the terrain hostile. There were gravity shifts, depressurized sections of ship, exposed power conduits, rooms filled with hot plasma, and dozens of other hazards. Only those helpful little notes kept us alive. Still, even though everything they said was helpful, the notes themselves were a bit disconcerting. They tended to be a little too precise, and Twitch swore that more of them were appearing in areas we'd already been through. Doc was leading the patrol that found the first tech priest. Unfortunately, he refused to speak to us and ducked through a hatch, which locked behind him. The second priest we found wasn't given the chance. Doc and Nubby covered the exits while Cutter tackled the cogboy. Holding someone at gunpoint and asking them for technical support and directions probably isn't the officially sanctioned way of doing this sort of thing. At least, not when they're on your side. But damned if it didn't work well. The conversation was a little awkward, though. The tech priest turned out to be one of the ones who had briefed us during the trip and was perfectly willing to talk to us. We did apologize. Once we learned how to use the map, we realized it was mostly empty space, but it did cover most of the important parts of the ship. It mapped out some of the bigger loading bays, the quarters the techies were using, and the locations of several critical systems, and the giant spinal shipping corridor and freight lifts that most of the servitors used. The best part was that the terrified tech priest showed us how to fill in the blank spots and add notes, which meant that we no longer had to depend on Doc's hand-drawn maps to get us back to our base. Not that Doc was a bad artist, mind you, he just had a little trouble figuring out how to draw a corridor that angled up and left while its gravity shifted to the right wall. With the map in hand, our recon patrol released the tech priest to go grease servitors or whatever, and went off to find the two helpful techies. The rough plan was to get a hand with the comm situation from the acolytes, but unfortunately they weren't in the quarters indicated on the map. Doc was dithering about whether to keep searching or wait for them to return, when Nubby suggested getting them to come to us. Based on our past experiences, Nubby argued, if we just annoyed enough of the senior tech priests or started breaking things, one of the acolytes would be sent to deal with us. Doc watched in horror as Nubby and Cutter went to work, but he didn't actually do anything to stop them. 3 gutted cogitator terminals, 2 corridors flooded with coolant, another filled with less pleasant substances, and a dismembered maintenance servitor later, Sarge's comm bead came to life. An exhausted-sounding tech acolyte Jim asked him to pick up his team before someone killed them. We still couldn't use the ship's comms. The acolyte said it was restricted to the priests for some techie reason, but our comm beads were being boosted by the larger system. Combined with the functioning map and Jim and Hannah's personal contact codes, we had everything we needed to survive the rest of the ship. So we all went back to base to get a night's sleep. Well, if not a night's, then at least a solid 10 hours worth. The ship's light systems seemed to be on several different clocks, and the ones in our quarters dimmed on a 3-hour cycle. Twitch eventually shot them out, and we just used our own lamps. Now, just to be clear, no one in the squad was a sissy, and none of us ever had trouble with warp travel before. We'd all faced down some incredibly weird and scary shit during our time in the Guard, not to mention what we'd seen as inquisitorial goons. Our nerves might not have been made of steel, but they were definitely iron or possibly some good quality bronze. That said, the nightmares we had that night were bloody terrifying. They were the sort of nightmares that take your every fear and failing and rub them in your face while you struggle to wake up and tell yourself it's all a dream. We all woke up covered in sweat when one of Twitch's perimeter alarms went off. We didn't even check what set off the alarm. All of us just sat there and thanked the Emperor for Twitch's paranoia. After a few minutes, Doc got up and pulled the yellow note off the inside of our door. It said, "In case of bad dreams, check Geller field integrity." That note had not been there when we went to sleep.